Hi, this is Walter Carmichael, giving my impressions on the first four books of the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. The first four books of the Bible tell an interesting story both of a people who are chosen and the God who chooses them. It all starts as a personal relationship for most of them, involving individuals who are able to communicate intimately and verbally and sometimes even physically with God. First with Adam, then Noah, and then Abram, Isaac, and Hagar, then Jacob, who seems to be God's chosen of Isaac's sons, even though he comes to power through deception. Joseph seems to have a slightly different relationship with God, as his communication happens through dreams instead of outright physical or verbal encounters. And finally, the last of these personal relationships seems to be that of Moses and Aaron. Even though Aaron eventually does take a back seat to Moses as the less favored of the two siblings. Usually, though certainly not always, God tends to communicate primarily through the males from the beginning. Even in the garden, his conversation regarding the fruit from the forbidden tree was only with Adam, or at least was primarily with Adam, even though Eve was at least as involved in the events that took place. In some respects, the first four books of the Bible create a picture of God who is trying to either establish himself as more than merely an angry regional deity, or at least establish a larger base of believers. Perhaps this is why he chooses a group of people to represent him as to bear the burden of his message to the world. Genesis makes the assumption that while God was responsible for the creation of the universe, that there are certainly people who are unaccounted for, at least in the literal scriptures. And while they may have been God created, there's no real clarity on that. They just kind of appear. And most of those other people don't tend to worship the God that would eventually become known as I Am. Or would eventually identify himself as I Am. Even Cain and Seth found wives and founded civilizations, but the wives themselves weren't actually, their creation wasn't explained in the actual scriptures. So, did other deities create these people, since none of the cultures they came from worship Yahweh, or are these merely individuals that were part of creation but not necessarily part of the initial story? The text itself is not really clear on this matter, at least not to me. The early books make it a point to explain that where the other civilizations were that eventually would originally conquer on their way to the Promised Land usually came from offshoots of their ancestral lineage, especially in the cases of the Amalekites and the Canaanites and various other indigenous groups of people to the or tribes to the what eventually would be known as the Promised Land. God seems willing to listen to several of these men as they bargain and reason with him. Abraham asks him to spare Sodom. And while that doesn't exactly happen, he did send his messengers to warn Lot and his family. He bargains with Moses constantly as Moses tries to preserve the lives of the people that he is leading out of Egypt. First, Moses even asked for someone else to speak for Yahweh instead of himself, since Moses is a stutterer. Then Moses begs for patience for the nation of refugees. That said, there are certainly times when God seems unwilling to negotiate. And I think part of that is due to, at least eventually becomes due to, the covenant and Israel being a called people. They're not necessarily called to be blessed and special as much as they're called to be special in that they are representatives of the one true God, and therefore would be held to a higher account than other people. The story told here in the first 4 books tends to be a story of how these people share a common history or heritage. Whether at the beginning of Exodus everyone truly involved in leaving Egypt was actually a blood descendant of Jacob seems irrelevant, because by the end of the journey, when they reach the promised land, they all will have had this common experience of living through the plagues, living through the trials at Sinai with the golden calf, being circumcised, being sent through the Ten Commandments, and then the agreeing to the Ten Commandments and the following laws, the Levitical laws that would come later. So even if they aren't necessarily how we would define a blood relation in modern terms, they certainly were a people who have been brought together with a common history and a common heritage and a link that would not easily be broken. In the original covenant with Abraham, God placed no real requirements on Abraham other than he get up and leave the place that he lived. There was no other expectation. God simply made him a promise. There were no sacrificial laws, no unclean animals. It was just more like a statement. Doesn't mean that the journey itself was easy. Certainly picking up and moving in that manner during that time of history would not have been easy. Travel in and of itself was dangerous, much less moving away from all your family and friends to a land that no one knows you, and certainly would not worship the God that you are worshiping, even if they respected your ability to worship. By the time Moses comes around, however, God has become far more strict, and he's while he is going to fulfill his promise, he's certainly not going to simply hand over the special land to a massive group of people who seem unwilling or unable to show gratitude or to put into practice those very laws that God seems to have laid before them. First, he makes certain they realize that they are slaves and completely dependent on someone, because from the time of Joseph, when they come to Egypt seeking refuge from the plague or from the drought, even though they're seeking refuge, they tend to at least somewhat seem like they do okay in Egypt, and then throughout the generations, God allows them to become slaves. Some of that seems to be, it doesn't really say this, but I wonder, some of that God seems to be fairly insistent upon making sure people are dependent upon him, and by having people become slaves, they realize that there is no hope for freedom short of an act of God. So they are completely dependent upon him, and then in order to free them, he humbles the mightiest nation in the region. Egypt would have been a superpower at the time, and so by crippling and humbling Egypt, he not only humbles Pharaoh, but he shows the Hebrew people that he has the ability to do that, and therefore there's a good reason to follow him and to trust that Moses actually knows what he's talking about. And then he leads them on a journey through the wilderness, leaving them completely dependent upon him for food and survival through the manna in the desert. Finally, he gives them a set of complex laws and building specifications in order to build the tabernacle. The laws are to ensure that they honor his presence among them by defining clean and unclean. By defining these two types of actions, God ensures that there is a focus on remaining clean in order to stay within his good graces. And along the way, he kills many of the Israelites for various offenses, be it doubt and complaining to or about Moses, or burning the wrong fragrances. Even Aaron and his sister get rebuked for questioning Moses' special stature, although certainly not killed. At first, God seems like a giving and at least friendly yet really powerful being, since he's responsible for the creation of the universe. As time goes on, he seems to become a harsher taskmaster, perhaps because he's seen the ruination of civilization once and doesn't wish to see it return to the way it was before the flood, or the way it was in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he believes that the strict rules will help his chosen people from straying and blending in with other cultures. If you're going to call a culture to become different, you don't do it so so that they can then go and blend in with everybody else. You do it so that they will stand apart, so that when people see them, they will recognize them as different and will recognize them as the children of the God of Yahweh. Um, Other gods at this point in the Bible seem to be worshipped, at least by other cultures, and it's not really clear whether at least the Hebrews deny the existence of other gods. They certainly seem to claim following. They certainly seem to claim to follow the God Yahweh, but they don't necessarily completely discount other gods. So I don't know that it's strict monotheism the way we think of it, as there's one God and only one God. I don't know that God really makes that statement until he talks to Moses, and says, "I am that I am what I am," and they should know me by that. Um, in this point in the story, there's a big problem with Hebrews running to other gods like Baal. Um, whenever they run into them in other cultures. So to me, that doesn't seem. It seems like they acknowledge the power of Yahweh, but they don't necessarily always accept that He's the only God in existence. Um, at least at this point in the story, God seems like one of many, and Baal may be his biggest competitor as they move toward the Canaanite land. While I get the impression the Israelites are monotheistic, and that they only worship one God, I'm not completely convinced that they believe that their God is the only God in existence. I certainly think that by later in the story, that's true. That they become abject monotheists, to the point that the only God in existence is Yahweh, and that in some ways is very different from the other cultures who accept that there are, they may worship one God, but they accept that there are a lot of different regional deities, and that's one of the reasons that the Hebrew people are called to be different. They don't accept the power. Eventually, they don't accept the power of other gods, and by doing so, it becomes a somewhat of a disruptive and argumentative force in the region. But it also allows Yahweh the strength or not the strength, allows Yahweh to convince them that He is the reason for their success. Um, So that is my understanding of God within the first 4 books of the Tetratuch, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And I look forward to hearing your responses.